Chapter 6. Eavesdropping. What was Malfoy's deal this year? Had his head gone wonky at some point in the war? It did happen, Harry knew. It had even been a close thing for him, at the lowest points of his spirit-breaking search for the Horcruxes. But Malfoy's behavior, though incongruous, wasn't exactly war-warped. It was just odd. First, there was the whole bit about wanting to be on civil terms with Harry, and now this game he was playing. Harry's pulse was still steadily humming and hiccuping, with a little shot of adrenaline each time Harry accidentally replayed the sensation of Malfoy's arms around his body. Was it just some kind of elaborate plot to mess with him? If it was, he ought to congratulate Malfoy on his resounding success. But that didn't quite fit, though it was an obvious answer. These new tactics for getting under Harry's skin weren't Malfoy's usual style. Loud, snide, and public. They were something else entirely, which left Harry to wonder if there was perhaps some other motive behind these latest provocations. The unsettling shift in Malfoy's attentions. But what exactly? Harry bit his lip, absorbed by his thoughts as he entered the 7th floor corridor. "Harry," squealed a female voice. Harry cried, jumping, his pulse erupting like a gunshot. His glasses slid down his nose with the sudden movement, so he pushed them back up, taking a deep breath to calm down. "Oh, it's you, Georgia." "Sorry," she said, having the courtesy at least to look bashful. "I didn't mean to startle you." "It's okay," Harry said with a sigh. "Fancying meeting you here, eh?" she said brightly. Georgia, we're outside the Gryffindor Tower," Harry pointed out. "Where we both live?" "Well, still." She was not to be deterred. "So, are you heading down to lunch?" This struck Harry as an odd question to ask someone who was currently walking upstairs, not down. "No, I was actually heading back to my dormitory to drop off some things." He was meeting Ginny in the library soon, and needed to trade his potions things for his transfiguration homework. "I'll come with you. I need to get my, gloves." "Gloves?" "Oh, you know," she said, gesturing vaguely. "It gets chilly." "Right, of course." They continued down the corridor, and were now face to face with the fat lady. "Plomeria," said Harry, and then climbed through the portrait hole into the common room. It was quiet, empty, save for the crackling fire on the hearth. The rest of their fellow Gryffindors were down in the Great Hall eating lunch. Well, all but one of them. Hermione sat curled up in her favorite armchair in front of the fireplace, reading her Muggle Studies textbook. Her chair faced away from the portrait hole, but in the empty common room, she clearly heard the portrait hole open to admit Harry. He was in conversation with Georgia McDonald, reluctantly, from the slightly pinched tone of his voice. "So," he was saying, "have you recovered all right from earlier?" Hermione smiled to herself in private amusement. She could imagine Harry's cornered expression, as if he were standing in front of her. Polite interest, just barely masking restless discomfort. He was rather awful at making small talk. What do you mean?" George's voice tilted uneasily. "The explosion?" "Oh," Georgia laughed, a vacuous, relieved giggle that would never emerge from Hermione's lips. "Of course, yes, I'm quite all right. Just a bit of a shock, that's all." She giggled again. "I imagine." Hermione realized then that Harry and Georgia were likely completely unaware of her presence, shielded from their view as she was by the chair back, and felt as though she ought to do something to announce herself. But then, it wasn't as if they were talking about anything terribly consequential or private, and if she said anything, they might decide to include her in their conversation. All things considered, Hermione decided she'd rather wait them out, and then return to her reading when the room was quiet again. It so rarely was, and she'd been quite contentedly enjoying her rare peace before they interrupted her. "So what happened?" Harry asked her. "Why did it explode anyway?" "I accidentally knocked all the beans in," Georgia lamented. Hermione winced. She'd finally been coaxed by McGonagall into dropping potions. It was only relevant to her post-grad invitation, to embroil herself in professional academia, specializing in Muggle studies, ancient runes, and history of magic. But she knew enough to know that the particular beings in question were highly volatile. Surely, even someone with Georgia would have had enough sense to be especially careful around them? I got startled, Georgia explained, her voice a blend of uncertainty and suspicion. I saw... Saw what? Harry sounded wary. Nervous, even. Why would he be nervous? What could have Georgia possibly seen in the potions classroom to make Harry nervous? Hermione was beginning to think this conversation was more significant and personal than she anticipated, and was well aware that her neglect to announce herself now cast her distinctly into the role of eavesdropper, yet couldn't bring herself to speak up. She was too curious. Harry had been acting odd lately. Several things just didn't add up. She wasn't sure why she thought anything Georgia said might bring answers when Harry hadn't opened up to Hermione or Ron, but she was hoping, somehow, that she might hear something enlightening nonetheless. Harry, you aren't, well... Georgia dithered. Out with it, thought Hermione, impatiently. Harry's not, therefore he must be what? You're not queer, are you? She spluttered in a sudden rush. Queer? There was a pause. Too long a pause? Before Harry exclaimed, No! In a tone of voice Hermione knew from years of close observation accompanied the sort of panicked expression Harry's featured favored when one brought up something he sincerely wished to avoid. Or when one hit a nail on the head that Harry had been trying to hide. You're not? No, I'm not queer. Well, it's just that I saw... Georgia trailed off, as if now unsure of what she had in fact seen. Hermione wanted to shake her. That was not what it looked like, interrupted Harry, before Georgia could reveal whatever compromising seeing she had witnessed. Not that it should have looked like anything. I mean, it was just nothing. Whatever it was that Georgia had seen, Harry was guilty. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Well, if you're sure, I'm not queer, Harry said again. Methinks the chosen one doth protest too much, thought Hermione wryly. Oh, good, sighed Georgia, with a palpable relief, more easily persuaded than Hermione by far. That is such a relief. Yes, well, Hermione could see in her mind's eye her friend's anxious posture, body angled away from Georgia, shoulders clamoring for attention of his ears, hands in his pockets or musing with his already messy hair. I have to go grab my stuff. Hermione listened to their footsteps as they disappeared up their respective staircases. Harry. Queer. No, it couldn't be. Except it would make certain amount of things make sense. And if Hermione had learned anything from her rather non-traditional friendship with Harry, it was that the preposterous was usually probable, as long as it was sensible, and often even when it wasn't. Hermione recalled conversations she had with Harry about relationships recently, especially when Ginny had been present too. It would explain his and Ginny's breakup, certainly, and blimey. Jumbled pieces rearranged themselves and clicked into place in Hermione's mind. She felt oddly relieved. She hated when things didn't add up. It grated on her nerves, passively but persistently. And now the pieces fit together, quite neatly indeed. Bloody hell, bloody hell, bloody hell, cursed Harry. Should he have told her? No, that wasn't the way to do it. To come out to some dippy, can't keep her mouth shut Georgia McDonald? But why not? It wasn't such a big deal, was it? If Harry was comfortable with it, why should it matter one way or another who he came out to, and when? He should be able to just admit it casually, especially when given such a clear opportunity as Georgia had just given him. It would have certainly put an end to all of her simpering. But no, it didn't feel right. He didn't want Georgia McDonald to know first. He didn't really want anyone to know, actually. But he especially didn't want Georgia to know first. Outside Ginny, of course. Bloody hell. Harry took a deep breath and grabbed the papers he needed, stuffing them haphazardly into his bag. Georgia was already idling by the portrait hole when he hopped down the last step of the staircase from his dormitory to the common room. "You ready?" she asked, pointedly pulling on the pink pair of cashmere gloves that clashed horribly with the striped Gryffindor shirt peeking out between the folds of her robes. Harry nodded, resigned to spending the trek down the next 3 floors with George's company. "You know," said Georgia conversationally, as the fat lady swung shut behind them, "I'd watch out for your pal Draco Malfoy if I were you." His pal? Was she kidding? Or was she really that daft? "I think he's keen on you." Harry laughed out loud. "That's ludicrous, Georgia." Georgia looked personally affronted. "No, it's not." "Yes," he assured her, "it is. I know what I saw today, Harry. And since you're not gay, then what was all that about during potions?" Georgia pointed out, clearly concluding that since there was no way 2 boys could touch each other without at least one of them being gay, and since Harry wasn't, it only stood to reason that Malfoy must be. Except Harry was gay, so in a sense Georgia was right, just not about the right person, because no way was Malfoy gay. I'm sure he was just... Harry stammered. The thing was, it had been Malfoy touching Harry, not the other way around. Bugger. Here he was, full circle, back to the thought process he had been hammering into the ground when Georgia had interrupted him earlier. Just what the hell was Malfoy's deal? Said Georgia, smirking. It was an expression that suited her the way it did Malfoy. The way it did Malfoy? Blimey, shut up, brain. You've got it wrong, Georgia. Malfoy does not fancy me, Harry said adamantly. Georgia's answering shrug said, "Whatever you say, Harry," but Harry knew he was right. Georgia was completely mad anyway. Right? Of course. Right. She didn't know what she was talking about. Draco Malfoy didn't, wouldn't, couldn't ever fancy Harry Potter. And vice versa, of course. Anyone in their right mind could tell you that. Finally, they reached the 4th floor. "Well, this is me," Harry said. "I'm meeting someone in the library." Georgia would have to go on without him now. She already disclosed her destination. Even she couldn't be so pathetically brazen as to find yet another excuse to follow him out of her way, though she appeared to be trying her best to come up with something creditable. "Who?" she asked, stalling. "Ginny." "Oh, okay then," she said reluctantly, after a minute of internal contention that was obvious in her squint of her eyes and the frown of her lips. "See you later, Harry." "Bye," Harry chirped, then turned off into the corridor that would take him to the west wing where the library was. Phew. His lips found his way onto his mouth again, and he chewed on it absently. Why was he so reluctant to come out? Ginny had been bugging him about it for weeks, and then just now Georgia had given him an optimal opportunity and he said nothing. No, worse, he denied the accusation. Was it possible he could be wrong? Maybe his mind had gone wonky in the war after all, warped into thinking he was homosexual. Could that happen? He didn't even know enough about psychology, but it seemed possible. And it wasn't as if he'd acted on any of these fantasies that had precipitated his conclusion. And without, physical evidence, how could he be sure really? It was more like a theory than a fact at this stage. Innocence until proven guilty, right? Harry tried picturing himself snogging Georgia. She was considered attractive, by and large. Tried to imagine vividly the way her lips would feel against his, how her tongue would feel curled around his, how her hands would feel running through his hair. And nothing. Not so much a flush of skin. Okay, well, that didn't necessarily mean anything. Georgia was very annoying, and probably not Harry's type of girl at all. Though he wasn't exactly sure what would qualify as his type of girl. Maybe he should try a different one. Yes, he would try. Just then, something caused Harry to look up. Another movement in the quiet corridor. "Hey," he said instinctually, greeting the person that walked in the opposite direction, who happened to be Draco Malfoy. Oh, bloss. Maybe guilty by association was more accurate. Harry's traitorous mind, distracted mid-thought, inserted Malfoy into the scenario that was supposed to prove his heterosexuality. Immediately, Harry blushed. "Hello," replied Malfoy, looking at Harry with an expression of vague astonishment on his delicate features. Said Harry. They'd come to a stop in the middle of the corridor. Now that he solicited Malfoy's attention, it seemed as though he ought to do something other than duck his head and dash to the library before Malfoy could absorb the anomaly that Harry had so accidentally instigated. "All right, then," he asked, uncertainly, his question a question in itself, if that was possible for a question to be such a thing as squared. How odd to be asking Draco how he was getting on, as if they were two amiable acquaintances passing by rather than bitter rivals of nearly a decade. "All right," answered Malfoy. Then, rather attentively, he added, "You?" And, amazingly, the world did not unravel around them. Apparently, it was possible for them to be polite to one another. Malfoy had been right. Blimey. Right. Oh, good. Right. Good. Harry nodded, as if in time to the awkward silence that seemed to pulse between them. "Well, then, I should, get on," said Malfoy, gesturing down the hall and sounding as uncertain as Harry had ever heard him. He and Malfoy had parleyed in many different tones over the years. Angry, taunting, even scared, but never awkward. Harry hadn't known Malfoy could even be awkward. Harry hadn't known Malfoy could laugh, either, or treat Harry with anything other than disdain. And here it was that he could do all three. Then and there, confronted with an awkward, civil Malfoy capable of laughing, Harry decided he would be civil in return. Like Malfoy pointed out, Harry had saved his life. Surely it was as rude as to be uncivil to someone whose life you saved as it would be to be uncivil to someone whom you owed your life. "See you later," said Harry, stepping away from Malfoy, moving on towards the library. "See you," said Malfoy. The 11-year-old in Draco was dying 1,000 ecstatic deaths. His 11-year-old self had been living in anticipation of this moment ever since Potter had refused to take his offer of friendship seriously, or shake his vulnerable, still untainted hand. 18-year-old Draco, on the other hand, 18-year-old Draco didn't know what to think. But he couldn't brood on this now, because at the other end of the corridor he could see Pansy approaching on the arm of Goyle. Fortunately, she appeared to be so absorbed in the conversation with the tall, dark, and hulking Slytherin that she hadn't seen him yet, so he still hadn't a chance at evasion. The question was, how? Draco didn't fancy the idea of skulking around in an empty classroom until they passed, and this part of Castle was most populated with teachers' offices anyway. He could pop in on a teacher with a question, perhaps? No, that was too out of character. They would suspect something. Where was he, anyway? The 4th floor. The library was on the 4th floor. Perfect. Draco could even be productive and look up that Romeo and Juliet reference. He about-faced and began striding quickly back in the direction Potter had been ambling when he surprised Draco with his unprecedented, amiable acknowledgement. That easily, Draco's mind was back on Potter. Again. Draco slipped with some great relief into the library. Truly, it was a lovely place. The subdued murmur of sotto-voice conversations, the floor-to-ceiling and wall-to-wall array of shelves, the thousands of elegant books on something out of a forgotten era of intellectualism as an art form. It was like walking into a mother's warm embrace. Or what Draco thought that might be, anyway. Malfoys weren't a warm sort, even by marriage. "Can I help you?" asked Madame Pince, as Draco approached her desk, looking down at him through the lenses of thick rectangular glasses perched on the top of her nose. Her coarse, graying hair was piled in a loose bun on top of her head that had to be held together in place by magic, or else it would have surely toppled onto her shoulders. I was wondering if you'd ever come across a reference to Romeo and Juliet, asked Draco, preparing to feel thoroughly daft when Madame Pince told him they were made up. Her eyebrows furrowed. Might you mean Romeo and Juliet, the Shakespearean tragedy? I might, Draco conceded. What's a Shakespearean tragedy? Dear boy, do not presume to tell me that you've never heard of Shakespeare. Well, I don't know. I mean, I probably have, hedged Draco skeptically. The Bard, the greatest writer the English language has ever seen? Draco shook his head. Bugger, did this guy sound important? How was it that Potter had heard of him when Draco was completely ignorant? Hamlet? Pressed the librarian, desperate for Draco to make a connection. Macbeth? But soft what light through yonder window breaks? It's east and Juliet is the sun? That's Romeo and Juliet, right? You know it? She asked, her glasses slipping off her nose in eagerness. No, Juliet is the sun. I figured. Oh, her disappointment felt personal. I suppose a Malfoy wouldn't have bothered with muggled literature. Of course not, she muttered, not intending Draco to hear. But it so happened that Draco had rather keen hearing. The comment stung, and it made him all the more determined to antiquate himself with this bard. So, can you help me? He prompted. Yes, Madame Pince sighed in resignation. She took a spare bit of parchment and wrote, Mug Fic S.H.A. Here's the call number. It's just over there, she said, pointing to a group of shelves towards the back of the library. Like I said, you're looking for the play called Romeo and Juliet, by William Shakespeare. Draco turned, hearing Madame Pince sigh again at his retreating back, and wandered towards the group of shelves. He felt like sighing himself. Honestly, how had he overlooked the greatest writer of all time? Supposing, of course, that the librarian hadn't been embellishing. They did tend to get rather worked up about these things, as a rule. Draco ran a slender finger along the spines of the books, murmuring, "Sha, sha, sha," as he scanned the names of the authors. Ah, Shakespeare. As Draco reached for the small leather book, with Romeo and Juliet embossed in gold on the spine, a voice broke, very familiar and very close by. Jin, not this again, groaned Harry Potter, sounding for all the world as if he was standing right next to Draco. Draco froze. Not what again? I'm sorry, Harry, said a second female voice, but you've got to tell them. Tell who what? Draco leaned closer to the shelf, behind which sat Harry Potter and the female, presumably Ginny Weasley, having a conversation they felt needed to be conducted in a far-off corner of the library, where they were unlikely to be overheard. Unfortunately for them, they hadn't bargained on Draco Malfoy and his newfound rapport for the bard. Draco cast a quick muffalo as a precaution, though it was more a formality. Draco was seldom caught engaging in such subtle activities. He was rather good at sneaking about when he wanted to be. Why? Potter was asking. Why do they need to know? Because they're your best friends? So? Doesn't mean they need to know everything about me. Draco found himself nodding absently in agreement. One should never keep one's friends too well informed. Nor would they want to, the female Weasley acceded. But they want to know this. You know they would. Potter was quiet. They deserve to know, she added, in a softer voice. Why do they deserve to know? Potter said with sudden vehemence. Why does everyone deserve to know everything about me? Just because I saved the wizarding world? Draco hadn't known Potter to ever use such a biting tone of voice outside his arguments with Draco. Doesn't make me communal property. Everybody line up for a piece of the chosen one. I'm not the fucking Berlin Wall. The bloody what? I don't have to tell anybody anything if I don't want to. Oh, don't be so dramatic, Harry. I'm not, Potter explained dramatically. Then, in a more subdued voice, he added, I just think I should be able to keep some pieces of me to myself. Sure, but this? It was quiet on the other side of the shelf for a moment. Draco could hear his intake and outtake of breath in the silence and opted to stop breathing, instead holding his breath in anticipation, though what of he couldn't say. Harry broke the silence. I don't see why I can't wait until it's relevant. I'm not even dating anyone right now, he said. That could change if you wanted it to, said the Weaselet pointedly. Draco's stomach dropped. His heartbeat became swollen in his chest, anxious and adamant. What exactly were they talking about here? When Harry didn't respond, she went on. Anyway, how do you think that would go over? Guess what, guys? Good news! I've taken up with someone. Oh, and by the way, he's a bloke. Wait, what? A bloke? A bloke? Draco's blood ran cold, and his skin prickled in the anticipation of Ginny Weasley's word penetrated him like 1,000 tiny needles. I don't know, Harry was saying, the conversation moving on, oblivious to the fact that Draco Malfoy was starting to hyperventilate on one side of the bookshelf. Probably about as well as they take me up and telling them I'm gay. Draco staggered back from the shelf, as if it had shocked him. Gay? Harry fucking Potter was gay. Since when? Draco half gasped, half yelped, and was very grateful that he, pre-knowing Potter was gay self, for having the foresight to cast Muffalo. That was not what he had bargained on hearing when he decided to eavesdrop. Potter and the Weaselet continued talking, but Draco was overcome by a sudden, sickening sensation of lightheadedness, and began to back away in a sort of stunned daze, clutching the copy of Romeo and Juliet tightly to his chest. He felt like he'd been confounded, like all his limbs had been asleep and just woken up, buzzing in agonizing, tingling dissonance. Mr. Malfoy, said Madame Pince, as he passed her desk on the way out. Are you going to check that out? What? Draco shook his head to clear the ringing from his ears, and forced his eyes to focus. The book. Right. Oh, yes. Yes, please. He slid the book across the desk and rubbed a hand absently through the soft tufts of his hair as he waited for it to be passed back to him. Catching up on a bit of reading. Draco's innards jumped with a sudden jolt of startled adrenaline and collided unpleasantly with his skin. What? He spun and jumped again. Potter was loitering behind Draco, his bag slung casually over his shoulder, and the Weaselet standing by his side. His hair was more tousled than usual, like he'd recently been thoroughly snogging. No Potter and snogging in the same thought. That was too queer, disturbing. Anyway, it wasn't possible. Draco knew where Potter had just been and what he'd been doing, and it wasn't snogging. Tousled hair was just as easily the product of agitation as snogging. Draco reminded himself. No need for his mind to jump ship into the gutter at such a slight provocation. Self-consciously, Draco dropped his hand from where it was, still raking through what was left of his own hair. Potter's was longer than his, he noticed. It mingled with his eyelashes and hid the tips of his earlobes, and brushed along the top of his robe. Yep, Draco gulped. Blast. Pull it together, will you? Yes, just indulging in dalliance with the bard, he elaborated, as if it was something he did on a regular basis, for pleasure. Fuck, a dalliance with the bard? For pleasure? The bard was a bloody bloke. Oh, hell, he was going to give Potter ideas. You don't say. The bard? Potter's lips quirked. Not exactly light reading, is it? Here you are, said Madame Pince, passing Draco the copy of Romeo and Juliet. Isn't it? Inquired Draco in what he'd hoped was a blasé manner. Potter glanced at the cover of the book before Draco could slide a hand protectively across it. Romeo and Juliet. I didn't know you were romantic, Malfoy, he teased. Draco flushed. I'm not. Really, I just, like the tragedy. Madame Pince had said it was a tragedy, hadn't she? Not a romance. I am most certainly not a romantic. We Slytherins do not have time or patience for anything so sentimental as romance, he sneered with more conviction than he felt. Unlike you Gryffindors, I imagine. You do seem rather fond of such fanciful notions. Fanciful notions. Potter arched an eyebrow. Draco hadn't known he could do that. Does Draco Malfoy not believe in love? I wouldn't really know, Draco said dismissively. Potter's lips pursed thoughtfully. A Slytherin by any other name, quipped the Weaselet. What? Are you not familiar with the play? Queried Potter, gesturing at the book in Draco's hands. I may not have read this particular one, Right, well, you'll see then. Draco rather doubted. Weasley to Malfoy translation didn't often come into coherent English. Okay. Well, enjoy your tragedy, Potter said, before the Weasley grabbed him by the hand and pulled him towards the door, leaving Draco standing alone, perturbed, and thoroughly flustered in the midst of the library, unknowingly clutching the single most epic romance in the English language to his pounding heart.